Hello and welcome to the Bestseller Experiment, where we continue to discover what makes a bestseller and inspire you to start, finish and publish your book. I'm Mark DeVoe.
And I'm Mark Stay. And a big thank you, as always, to the people who keep this show on the road, which is our patrons over on Patreon and our academates on the Bestseller Academy. If you want to find out more about the Academy, you get me and Mr. D as your personal tutors. You get a fantastic writing community. There are courses. And we've got some amazing stories coming up from people who've done amazing things in the Academy coming very soon. Go to academy.bestsellerexperiment.com. Link in the show notes to check that out. And if you want to check out Patreon, loads of deep dives, over 120 deep dives. We've got some really cool stuff out there at the moment. Do go to bestsellerexperiment.com/support. And we have some new patrons this week, Mr. D.
We do.
We got quite a crowd. So everyone budge up at the back of the bus and make room, please, for Aggie, for Margie, or could be Margie, Paul Clark and Toby Easton O'Connor. You're all wonderful people. Thank you so much for your support. We simply could not keep this podcast going without it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. D, how are you, sir?
I'm doing all right. It's good to be back, Mr. Stay. And I also want to say a big thank you, I know you do as well, to Queeve and Julian for filling in at such short notice.
They're amazing.
Absolutely brilliant podcast. And yes, I did. I had to dive off very, very short notice because unfortunately my dad became very ill and he did pass away. So I had a bit of a challenging couple of weeks. But you know what? It's really interesting because it's been a couple of things fascinating, really, when you kind of like tie it in with writing. I was going through a lot of paperwork for my dad, and he wrote a lot of stuff. He started writing his life story. And
really?
And at times like this, I mean, anyone who's lost a parent or let's say lost anyone dear to them, when they find anything written, you know, after they've left us, it's such a treasure. It's like their voice is there. And for my dad as well, like the sad thing about my dad's journey is that he had quite late stage dementia last couple of years, and so that beautiful voice that he had was kind of trapped inside him. But to be able to pull out these words that he had written, and he was such a good writer, it's so incredible because it brings that person back to life. Literally, like when you're sitting with them and they can't communicate with you. So it's really made me reflect deeply, and I'm showing up here today to remind everyone, like, what you're writing today, what you write tomorrow, next week, lives forever, and it's treasured by everyone who loves you and will love you, and who will get to know you, and as you grow as a writer. And remembering that one thing alone, I think, can destroy all of the self-doubt, all of the challenges, all the stress. Just get the words down. It doesn't matter at the end of the day, if they're perfect or not. To have the gift of being able to read the words of somebody. So yeah, I miss him dearly. And actually, this made me reflect as well. COVID, like, I thought about all those poor people who lost parents or partners or uncles, aunties, brothers, sisters during COVID, and couldn't actually even be with them or even have a funeral. And so in a weird way, I'm just so immensely grateful that we got to do that for Dad. Again, you can always find a reason to be grateful for everything. My heart goes out to anyone who's going through a similar thing right now. But you've got to look at these things and realize just the parting gift of everyone that leaves us is a reminder to get on with our lives, to live our lives, to make the most of every moment. And we just have to embody that.
You are so super positive. I'd be a gibbering wreck at this moment, but
the other thing I will say though is my dad was very philosophical about life, and that makes this whole journey a lot easier. He had an amazing life, and he lived a great life, and he achieved a lot. PhD physicist. He wrote a ton of like research papers, which are all on Google. People go read it if you're interested in ecology, population, sustainability, environment. That was his jam. So he's written a ton of stuff in there.
Important stuff as well.
Top level stuff. Yeah, and he got a couple of lifetime achievement awards from some major organizations. So he's a lot of his work is gonna be contributing to the future generations. So that's heartwarming as well. But But anyway, after all that, how are you doing? You've had a couple of weeks.
I'm okay. Yeah, it's been, like I said, we'll talk about it more in the extended version. It's a roller coaster, but I'm slightly knackered because I was out on the Razzle last night with Queve McDonald and Ben Aronovich. we did an event at the at Waterstones in Trafalgar Square, and it was terrific. It really was great. It was completely sold out. Great crowd, great questions. And Queve said to me, "Oh, do you want to come in and chair the conversation?" And frankly, it was like at the fireworks where you light one firework and you step back and just let it go off. That was my job. My job was not to get in the way of these two. And they were so much fun. They were really funny. They're terrific writers and raconteurs, and the crowd just loved it. And there was a really good signing afterwards. So it was a really, really fun evening. And we all went to the it wasn't planned, but we put around to the Sherlock Holmes pub afterwards. And had a
fantastic.
very good
actually
chat.
In Baker Street by any chance?
No, it's not. It's a really touristy pub in Northumberland Avenue, which I'd never been in before, but it was just around the corner from the bookshop. So yeah, that was good fun as well. Yeah, really good fun.
That's great. I just envisage you a bit like one of those referees in a world championship boxing match. And you're like getting in between them. It's like little Mark stay in the middle.
I want a clean fight.
It's like the comedy version of that with knowing Ben and Queve, right? I can't imagine what that would have been like. The two of them riffing off each other with you in the middle. Like,
I
brilliant.
just basically felt like I had a front row seat. I was sitting between them with a big silly grin on my face, and occasionally just, trying to keep them on track. But
it's the only way to get a ticket. It's the only way to guarantee a ticket is to actually compare the event, right? Love it.
It was really good.
And
really
Trafalgar Square, I must admit, going back to London, having lived on a little old island for nearly 10 years now in Canada, the energy in London's bonkers. I forgot just how amazing it is. Like,
I love it.
It is. It's like you go in and it's just like walking into Leicester Square. It's just like, whoa, this is insane. Like, there's just so much life and colour and noise and excitement. Brilliant. Brilliant stuff. Well, listen, we've got so much to talk about because not only has there been a lot going on with movies and, passings of parents and all these things, but that we've also got this absolute headliner interview today, which I'm so glad to be back for, Mark. So tell us about our amazing guest today.
Well, where do you start? It's Richard Armitage, the actor. He's amazing. He's been in shows like Spooks and Strike Back and North and South. I know him as Thorin Oakenshield in The Hobbit, which, he is fantastic in it, absolutely brilliant at it. But also, he's a very, very prolific audiobook narrator. He's got this incredible baritone voice, which is lovely. And so what he's done now, he's done an audio original for Audible, a thriller called Geneva. And it's this fast-paced psychological thriller. It's about a scientist. They go to Switzerland for a conference, and then they become entangled in this conspiracy. It's terrific stuff. It's really, really good. And it was a great opportunity to talk to an actor as well, not only about audiobook narration, but about their approach to character, which I found absolutely fascinating. And I think it's one of these things we've often said to writers, if you've got no acting experience, take some acting classes, try and do it, because there's so much that I carry over from my acting experience into writing, and Richard has done the same. So we discuss resisting the temptation to explain, character studies, and not tying up loose ends, and much, 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 much more.
Oh, so much in this interview, folks. It's an absolute brilliant one. So let's sit back and enjoy Mark chatting with the absolutely wonderful Richard Armitage.
Richard Armitage, welcome to the Bestseller Experiment. How are you today?
I'm really good. Thank you for asking.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on the show. Geneva. I've been through it very briefly once on the way to somewhere else. Tell us about Geneva.
It was a bit of an experiment, actually, on everybody's part. I was asked to write something by Audible, and I kind of immediately said yes, and then did that thing that actors tend to do, which is like, oh, now I've got to do the work. But I did have a story in my head that was brewing. And I set it in Geneva because I wanted it to be the center of kind of scientific excellence. But I was sniffing around Sarah Gilbert, who'd kind of was heading up the vaccine program in the UK, the AstraZeneca, and I just became fascinated with her. And I thought, what if I take a character like her, just the sort of skeleton of a character, and throw her into a crime thriller, because that was the brief. So yeah, I mean, Geneva is it's a crime thriller about a Nobel Prize-winning scientist who is taken to Geneva to a conference to sort of front up a brand new treatment for dementia. And during the course of that 4-day trip, strange things start to happen to her in her own mind, because she has a diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's. So it's a bit of science, it's a bit of science fiction, it's a bit of crime, and all those good things that we like to read about.
Fantastic stuff. Now, you mentioned your protagonist, Sarah Collier, is based partly on Sarah Gilbert.
Yeah.
Now, the audiobook, you're narrating the audiobook alongside Nicola Walker, who you've worked with before, most notably on Spooks. When you were writing, were you thinking, oh, this could be good for Nicola? Or were you thinking, did Nicola come later in the process?
She came later in the process. I wasn't really writing. Actually, I was sort of writing as if I was listening to Sarah Gilbert. She was such a good inspiration. I mean, I hope she's not offended, because it's really, the character's life is nothing like hers at all. I mean, I suppose I've taken her scientific expertise as a sort of just a foundation stone. But no, I had all kinds of people in my head as I was writing, and then Nicola's name was being talked about more and more towards the end of the process, and I got very excited because I know what Nicola is like as an actor, so I did start to hear her voice in my head, and it was really interesting writing for Audible and audio first, because it's going to be heard before it's going to be seen with the eye. We don't even know if that's going to happen yet, but it was a very different process. So I was speaking everything out loud and making sure all the words sounded right. But I knew that Nicola's voice would be just so perfect for this character, and she really didn't disappoint. I was so impressed with what she did in the recording. Excellent stuff. Let's go back and talk about how Audible came to you with this, because you're already a very prolific audiobook narrator. You've narrated the likes of CJ Tudor, Joy Ellis, Philippa Gregory, and friend of the podcast, LJ Ross. You did her book Bedlam, which is fantastic. So Audible came to you, they already knew that people liked your voice, but they came to you with a brief. Can you talk about that brief and what they came to you with? Yeah, I mean, I think it is really interesting, because they obviously have a lot of data about who's listening and what kind of things they're listening to, what kind of books, my voice was leaning into. And crime thriller seemed to be this kind of cocktail that everybody quite liked, not just from what I was reading for Audible, but the types of shows that I was involved in as an actor. So a lot of the Harlan Coben work, and even going right back to things like Spooks. It sort of felt like when they asked, I did kind of think, yeah, they've really got their finger on the pulse of what my vibe is. But it was it wasn't a direct offer. They basically said, how would you feel about it? Can we, would you like a ghostwriter? And I sort of said, well, no, if I'm going to write it, I really am going to write it, because I'm going to speak these words, and I couldn't live with myself if I was speaking someone else's words, pretending I'd written it. Yeah. I'm not at that stage yet, but I, again, so there was a process of really having to prove myself to them before we actually went down the road. But I'd written a lot in the past. I'd written not for publication, but for myself. So I knew that I had a kind of voice, but whether it was going to be, what they had in mind as well was part of the navigation. But once we got on the right track and we were all on it together, it was a breeze to do and really fulfilling for me. Did you have to sort of do a one-page pitch for them? Did you have to put anything together, or was it just a conversation that you were having with them? I think it started as a conversation. Then I submitted, I think it was like a 5,000 word. Actually, it was a treatment first of all, and then a 5,000 word writing sample. So just to sort of see, what kind of, how does he structure his sentences? Is this going to be just what's it going to sound like? What's the feel of it? And I did recognize, like I went back to that writing sample when I'd finished the book, just to see, what was I like when I kicked off, and really, and this comes back to who I am as a person and where I come from, my background, my education. I feel like I was slightly overcooking. I was adding loads of ingredients because I wanted to prove myself as some kind of intellectual, but realizing along the way that really it wasn't about that. It was about just really good storytelling in the way that I would want to tell a story, because that's literally what's going to be happening. It's going to be me sitting in front of a microphone reading the story. But I discovered what my tastes were along the way, which was really interesting.
Excellent. What in particular what stood out for you?
Just things like sentence structure, the sounds of words, the rhythm, and I was originally a musician. I played flute and cello, and I come from a dance background, and so song and dance background. Actually, I was a musical theatre actor before I went to drama school. So all of those little things that I'd sort of written off years ago started to come back into my life, because I do have a certain taste in the way words sound, and the it's quite hard to describe. I worked once with a playwright, Mike Bartlett, who was a drummer, and his work is so synonymous with the rhythm of drumming. And I kept thinking about him as I was writing, that when a story starts to escalate as you're telling it, and you need this, like your words just get shorter and more staccato as you're, if you overwrite something, when the action needs to compress and get faster, it's very difficult to perform. So I was sort of almost DJing my own writing as I was working.
That's brilliant. And in all the years of narrating audiobooks, is there anything that, and you don't have to name names or anything like that, but is there anything you see authors doing that you think, oh, I wish you wouldn't do that, or this is really difficult to say or pronounce? Is there anything, any commonalities you see with authors that you took a lesson and thought, I'm not going to do that in my book?
Yes, absolutely. And I do, it's one of the joys of my life is that I get to read such a kind of broad spectrum of literature. So from Dickens to, I read Marcus Aurelius. This year I did Grapes of Wrath, and then I'm reading, Joy Ellis and like you say, L.J. Ross and C.J. Tudor. So I've got myself in knots. Agatha Christie was one of them. There was a book I read. I can talk about her because she's dead, so she might be offended. But I remember reading a Poirot, and I was so excited to read it, and she'd set it in France. I think it was Murder on the Links. And I started to read it and realized she'd written so many characters, and they were all French, and I only had one French accent. I was like, how on earth am I going to distinguish between all these people? So I was very careful to make sure that each character was very definable, but without really describing them in too much detail. I want to give the audience a picture of who they were, but not too specific so that the reader would be hemmed in. And also, I think, one of the things, particularly in crime fiction or very plot-heavy work, is that, and I took this advice, I think it was from Margaret Atwood in one of her masterclasses, is that tying up all of the loose ends, while it can make sense, it's not always that satisfying. And sometimes it's okay to leave things unexplained. And the more you try to explain it to make it make sense, the more tangled you become. And sometimes it's like, let's just remove all of this information that I'm giving you to try and explain why this has happened, and just leave it hanging, so that we don't necessarily need to show that. So myself and my editor would, and I have this in acting as well, is that we had this thing of know, don't show. So to just know something, but not to show it or to over-explain it. And because I do have a tendency to want to sort of prove myself by saying, this does make sense. Look, this whole sequence makes sense, and I'll show you how it makes sense by showing you every doorway and every pathway. But it can really weigh it down. And obviously the thing, parts of the story really do need to make sense, which is why I took a trip to Geneva.
Yes, I'd like to talk about that in a minute. But just to go back on your work as an actor, as I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I've heard that when you take on a role, you will do extensive biographies for your characters. You'll look into all kinds of backstory. Is that something that you carried over into Geneva? Was your writing an extension of that process?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's when I knew that I had the ability and propensity to write, because when I develop a character, one of the things that I really like to do, for acting is I take control of the character in its early stages by, like you say, writing a biography, and I've done it since I was at drama school, and that involves a certain amount of free flow, and I really enjoy that moment where you just start writing and you don't really plan what you're going to write. It just sort of comes out of that part of your brain which you're not in control of. So when you write is quite interesting as well. So first thing in the morning or last thing at night, as your brain is more relaxed and less infected by the day, all kinds of things can come through which aren't necessarily integral to what you're writing. And most of the time when you write biography, no one's ever going to read this. I've got books and books and books of stuff that no one's ever going to read. And things would come out that I just think that's not important to the character, but it's really interesting where that came from, because I was kind of pulling up memories that I'd forgotten about, and also things that a little bit like deja vu, things would come out that you think, I've never experienced that, but it's coming out of some kind of truth again, I would write with pen and paper, not on a computer screen. So that hand-eye thing, whatever it is they call it, where you connect to your brain. And I really love doing that. I didn't do it for this, but the process of creating a biography for the characters was I did do that. I did write extensive biographies for the two lead characters, because I knew that as I was writing in a more economic way, all these threads that led back to a very rich garden. It's like planting a garden. You put down so many seeds, and then you might draw on them later down the line, or you might not. But it was very satisfying to do that.
Wonderful. And what do these biographies look like? I know you say they're not for no one else is going to read them except you, but is it just thoughts going onto the page, or is it more specific things like height and eye color and where they were born and things like that, or is it a combination of the two?
What it actually looks like is a legible scrawl, but I sort of have I have a checklist which goes right back to some work I did at drama school, which is it's 3 pieces of paper of a checklist of things that you just almost like a little quiz about your character. And I do that first, which is sort of like, where are they from? Where were they educated? What are their politics? Who are their inspirations? What books do they read? What music do they listen to? What's their favorite food? All of this stuff that you just fill it in before you've even started knowing who they are. So you do that bit, and then I think a character, and I say this because when you create character for screen, you use bits of yourself. Mm-hmm. So it's always about programming just enough memory and enough experiences so that it feels like a whole life. Obviously, you can't go and write an entire life, because it would be, in my case, 51 years of information, but significant moments in that person's life which may have triggered where they are in their life right now. I just try to plot those things in, like with this book, with Geneva, how these two are a couple and how their marriage is being strained. I just thought, okay, it's important to know, how did they meet? Where did they meet? What were they like when they met as younger people? Mm-hmm. And what's changed in their lives? When did their daughter arrive? Where is she from? Where is he from? All of these things that and you can expand on that. And it's really satisfying to do that. And you can change it, of course. You can retrofit it. So if it doesn't work, further down the line, I'll just go back and change the biography, because it's my world I'm building.
Brilliant stuff. Now, you mentioned research there. You mentioned going to Geneva. I mean, you underwent waterboarding for Spooks. You will do this kind of research, physical stuff. Was there anything else that you did for Geneva apart from going to Geneva?
I was pulling on some memories of researching a role that I'd played in a play at the Birmingham Rep back in the late 90s called The Four Alice Bakers. And part of that, it was about genetic cloning, and part of that research took me to Cambridge University, and I sort of walked into a building and grabbed a white coat off a hook and just found myself in a lab, and in my head, I broke into the lab and did my research that way. But it was just, there was no man on the door. And I just sort of stood around watching people with pipettes and things, and no one looked up. But so that experience of being in a laboratory triggered some things for the show, for the book. But again, it's a combination of fact and fiction. So my fictional mind can do whatever it wants, but it goes. You find the blood vessels that lead back to a factual event. So the neural implant, I think is actually in production right now. I think it's in development, should I say, with the world's richest man.
Right.
So that was one of the inspirations for that. But yeah, there's all kinds of things, and also, I traveled to the mountains a lot, so I love the idea of setting the story at altitude, and I'm fascinated with architecture. So I pulled up loads of images of what the Schiller Institute would look like. So I basically designed the building in my head, and then I went and found, picked photographs of what the building would look like, so that when I came to write about it, I could actually describe what the facets of glass were like and things like that. It's so enjoyable to do that work.
Absolutely. At what part of the process were you doing that? Was that before you were writing, during, or after, or a combination?
I intended to do it halfway through because I was going to try and squeeze in a cheeky ski trip, but I got caught up on another job, so I actually had to do it right at the end. But I'd left little holding points in the book where I knew I would go back and fill it with detail, the kind of things that. You can Google it, or you can go to Google Earth, you can look at Google Maps, but somebody walking past you on the street that happens to be wearing a red coat or something, those things you can't really plan, or how the wind is on a certain day, and what the parks looked like and what kind of trees were in the park. I just felt like I wanted to go and really see that for myself. I wanted to make sure all of the geography was correct so that the journeys took the right amount of time. Because those things really annoy me when I see them on TV. That you can travel between Manchester and Liverpool in 20 minutes. All those things that trouble me. So I wanted to make sure it sort of worked. But yeah, it was towards the end, I would say.
My favourite one of those is in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, where they land in Dover and he says, "We'll be in Nottingham by tonight." And
you'll be lucky.
Yeah, couldn't even do that now, mate.
We actually shot a promo very, very late in the day, and they found a location for the promo, and there was this sort of suspended glass box, which I hadn't written about, but I just thought it was so brilliant, I've got to put it in the book. So I even went back at very, very late and just did tiny little detail that I'd shifted, because I just thought, it was I wanted it all to line up and match, and so again, it's my world, so you can do whatever you want with it as long as you hit the deadline.
Exactly. Now, I read somewhere that you wrote to a kind of a template for Geneva. Is that correct? And what can you tell us about that?
Yes. So there were various stages, which I think worked for me. I don't know how other writers do it, but I created the treatment, then I did a writing sample, then I wrote quite a detailed outline of what the story would be.
Right.
And then we went, with my editor, we went much further and I worked out what the word count needed to be. So I roughly knew how many chapters I was aiming for, and broke it down so that I could write a very short paragraph of what was going to happen in each chapter. So, which is a bit like how when you do television, because you shoot out of order, each scene is described in the call sheet in a certain way. So, the scene will be 4 pages long, but it will just be described as this happens to this person in this scene. And I would write the things that needed to happen in each chapter. because I knew I was going to be working on other things, like I was doing a film, and my brain would be taken away. So I needed to go back and figure that out, which was really useful, so that when I could just dip into a chapter and figure out, okay, I need to get from A to B in this chapter, and how am I going to do it?
And where were you storing that? Are you just doing this in Word? Are you using any particular kind of software?
I was using, I started using Ulysses because I work on a Mac, but then I went to Word, which was much more useful because the editor could then, drop in and make her comments in the margin.
You mentioned your editor there. Obviously, this is a whole new process to you, working with an editor and going through that whole process of getting something published and then recorded. Were there any big surprises? Was there anything that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think working with an editor is a little bit like working with a director, because you are putting yourself on the line, but at the same time, you have to accept another person's view, another person's vision. You have to be able to be molded. And I'm pretty good at that. I'm very good at yielding. But also, you sometimes have to accept that my taste and their taste are different. Luckily, Josephine Lane, who was my editor, we kind of have very similar taste. She's very experienced, and she knew this format, this genre very, very well. This was new to me. I wasn't conscious too much about writing to format, because I feel like it's a bit like if you're in a horror movie, you don't know you're in a horror movie. That's the director's business. So I was trying not to write in a thrillery way, but also there are quite a lot of personal things in there that the editor doesn't necessarily know are very personal. But I think that's good, and I think because you have to step back and be objective about your own work. So the cutting process was quite painful at the beginning, but I completely got in line and understood why things needed to go and why things didn't work. But at the same time, it was my first piece of writing, so I knew that I had something to prove. So I did dig my heels in about certain things that I was adamant I wanted to remain. But it's a negotiation, and she was brilliant. And I'm sure they were all, everyone at Audible was probably a little bit nervous because, you go very quiet for a while. It took about 12 months to maybe a little bit longer to write. So that experiment could have been an absolute disaster. But I'm sure they would have knocked it into shape. But I just wanted to make sure that, first of all, they were my words. So any suggestions that came through, I would have to sort of massage them into my own words. But that, again, it's a learning process, and I'm just glad that I'm quite a flexible person because it wasn't too painful at all.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it's all about. You mentioned Harlan Coben earlier, who knows a thing or two about writing thrillers. Are you friendly with Harlan at all? Did you go to him for advice?
It's really interesting you should say that. It was literally the next thing on my mind
because
we were going to work together again next year, and I'd had a meeting with him, and we'd had a cup of tea, and I'd asked him to read the book, but I was very nervous about it because it's you're stepping into a slightly different lane, and I was stepping a little bit into his lane. But I did, at the time, I was going through quite a chunky edit, which was removing quite a lot of the work. And I said, how are you with edits? How do you deal with it? And, what's your process? And of course, because he's so experienced now, he did say, I'm quite lightly edited. I think he knows what, he knows his thing now. He knows what his style is. So his editing is quite light. Whereas I think I was trying to write Proust, and they were like, no, you've got to get this into an airport thriller. But I'll know better for next time,
Brilliant. I want to go back to something you said earlier on, which is that you had written stuff, but you had written it for yourself. Were you referring to character bios then, or were you writing prose before this? If so, what sort of stuff were you writing?
No, I haven't written anything that's waiting to be published. All of the stuff that I've written was character biography or a diary. I've done a few adaptations of books that I would be interested in developing for television, and I've sort of written a first episode to see if it works. But as you know, and I'm actually working on a book right now, one of C.J. Tudor's books, The Taking of Annie Thorne, and we are developing that to screenplay. But I'd done a first sort of sample of what might episode 1 be like. So I'd written it, and obviously, I wasn't an established writer then. Maybe I've got a bit more credibility now. So we do have another writer on it. But these things, I don't feel like they're a waste of time. It's a bit like you have to exercise the muscles to see whether they work. But when you then do get into a process with a writer now, that I'm working with writers and editing and adapting with them, and I'm working with a very experienced writer, Tim Dynevor, and a less experienced writer, Zara Symes, and it's really useful to be able to understand story structure and dialogue, because a lot of writers are great at story, but when it comes to dialogue, they can kind of get a bit stuck.
Right.
So I feel lucky because I've read a lot of books, but I've also read a lot of screenplay and scripts. That you only get cast in about 1% of everything you read. So I've read a huge amount. So you get access to a lot of people's voices, and so I think all of these things are becoming quite useful.
Well, you mentioned dialogue there, and writers can sort of get unstuck when it comes to dialogue. Are there any sort of common errors that you see with dialogue that you wish writers would get better at?
I was always, when I was at drama school, I kind of got heavily into David Mamet. And obviously,
me too!
I mean, True and False is one of those great acting books that I just love.
Fantastic book, yeah.
But again, David Mamet, I think Bartlett that I talked about is sort of in that same Mamet lane, but also Pinter. Slightly obsessed with Pinter, and he said something very interesting in one of his books about writing or developing, is that he was just talking about how people don't really explain who they are as characters. They exhibit characteristics and other people will describe them, but very rarely does a character tell you who they are in their own dialogue. And a lot of the time in screenplay as well, sometimes when a writer has struggled to plot the story, they'll put it into the dialogue of a character, and you feel like you're having to explain the plot through your dialogue, which is, we call it expositioning. So, and you try to strip it out so that it just doesn't feel like you're saying the plot. Because I think that's an observation that I've had all of my acting life, is that most of the time as human beings, the things that come out of our mouths are often concealing what we feel, not explaining how we feel, unless you're in America, because they do the opposite. They say everything they feel, but most of the time we're sort of hiding what we feel or think in the shell of something else. And Pinter does it brilliantly. I mean, if you look at Pinter and some of his lines are so obscure, and you look at it and you go, what does that mean? And it doesn't mean anything. It's just hiding something else inside. And I love that kind of thing. I love implication. I love an enigma. Like I love, an enigmatic line, but it's like, what on earth does that mean? I enjoy that a lot.
I was lucky enough to see a production of The Caretaker with Donald Pleasance and Colin Firth played Aston, and it was just absolutely blew my mind. I was like 17 years old, and I was like, I wish I could write like that. And I've been trying to do it ever since. Now that you've had a taste, you mentioned you've been working on screenplays, but now you've had a taste of writing a novel. Well, first of all, you mentioned, we don't know if there's going to be a paperback or a physical hardcover or whatever edition of it. We don't know that yet. But now you've done this once, do you think there will be more? Do you want to go back and do this again?
A bit like reading a book. When a book that you've loved comes to an end, you have a slight feeling of grief because you're not going to be with these people anymore, and you've spent so much time and investment with them. And I had that at the end of Geneva. Once the book was recorded and done, I just felt like, who am I going to play with now? Like my friends have gone, because, it's so strange. Like you create a world, you create your characters, you leave them for a while, you go off and do something else, you come back and they've been busy, they're evolving, and it's like you give them a life of their own. And so I sort of miss the characters, and I'm desperate to get kind of back into the soup of writing again. So my first thing I did is I picked up the phone to my literary agent and I said, can I do it again? And he said, well, let's put out feelers, let's ask around. But of course I'm impatient. So I had already started writing treatments for a couple of other stories just in case. So yeah, I like to have something on the stove simmering, that I'm slowly adding ingredients to. So yeah, I've got a couple of treatments that are expanding and becoming more detailed, and I would absolutely love to do it again.
Brilliant stuff. Well, listeners, Geneva is out there. It's on exclusive to Audible at the moment. So go treat your ears with that and have an absolutely thrilling time. Richard, thank you so much for speaking to us today. I really appreciate it and hope to speak to you again soon.
Thank you for having me.
What are your writing dreams? Finishing that book, quitting the day job, becoming a best-selling author? Well, over 4 years, we've studied the advice of over 300 best-selling authors who've collectively sold over 500 million books. And we are excited to announce the Bestseller Academy. If you're ready to take your writing to the next level with accountability, craft, and coaching, your bestseller dreams are now only a click away. To find out more and apply, visit bestsellerexperiment.com/academy. That's bestsellerexperiment.com/academy. I mean, where do we start, Mark? What a legend. What an absolute legend. I mean, there's so many things he's been in as well. People, I mean, firstly, just hearing his voice, you think, audiobook narrator. Like if he wasn't an actor, he'd have a life, it'd be back-to-back audiobook narration, possibly late night DJ, all kinds of things. But let's dive in and talk about this idea of first thing in the morning and late at night, because I really jumped on that. This idea that Richard talked about, that when your brain isn't kind of frazzled or it isn't distracted.
Yes, the phrase he uses is less infected by the day. And I totally relate to that, because first thing in the morning, I'm a first thing in the morning writer, and I will, I turn off notifications, shut the door, the whole thing, and when I was commuting, I'd put the headphones on, I'd try and block off the world, try not to be infected by the day. It's such a great phrase, because it will creep in, and if you give it an inch, it'll take a mile. There have been days when I've forgotten to turn off notifications on my phone. It go ping, and I go, oh, what's that? And then 10 minutes later, I look up and I've lost my flow, I've lost my rhythm. So I think it is really, really important. And if you're one of those people at the end of the day, maybe when you're putting the day behind you, it's setting the sun, and you can concentrate on your writing that way, then if that works for you, that's great. But yeah, it's so important, because now you're gonna laugh. Okay, I've been reading a book about the Beatles, and they were going on about meditation, right? And I'm reading it. I'm thinking, I might have to give this a go.
Oh, it's to stay. All right, the bestseller experiment has officially ended. Mision accomplished. Words I never thought I would hear on this podcast.
I haven't done it yet.
Oh my gosh! No, I'm done. I can die a happy man, Mark. I'm getting my knapsack, and I'm off now to my next mission. No, I think this is brilliant.
I'll tell you what else converted me. I spoke to an author yesterday called Amita Parekh, who's coming in a future episode, and you're going to love this one. She's sporty, and she talks about how sport is great training for being a writer, and she meditates. You are going to be in hog heaven when we don't end the podcast now. But yeah, I'm thinking, because I'm getting so, especially after this weekend with the film coming out, and getting bombarded by
completely.
I mean, distraction central. Yeah. Bing, bing, bing. It was so hard to write anything more than 200 words. You look at my word count for that weekend, and it was I did write every day, but one of them was like one day I wrote 204 words. I thought, that's it, I've done it, I'm out.
Yeah, but the fact that you did that, Mark, the fact you even in amongst the maelstrom, right? 204 words. That's the whole point of it. I think that's absolutely brilliant. But it's this. I think this is a really important thing that you're picking up on, because, I mean, just going back to what Richard said, the way that I think of it is when we're writing and there's tons of distractions and there's a lot in our mind, like the real estate in our head, if you like, is completely full and jumbled. It's a bit like being tuned into a radio station, but not quite. You know, when you can kind of just about hear that there's a bit of music, but you can't quite work out. And so there's a lot of static and interference. Mm-hmm. And so I think what Richard's talking about is that it's actually tying it right into 95.8, so you get that clarity come through. And I do believe that any kind of mind exercise, whether we call it meditation or whether we call it relaxation or whatever, you know, because Richard talked about when the brain is more relaxed. I mean, that's what meditation does for us, is it kind of gets us in, and is scientifically proven to help us focus. I mean, that's one of you meditate in the morning and your day is different. Your day is absolutely different. And also all the crap that comes flying. I don't know about, I mean, maybe other people can acknowledge, but give you a little preview, Mark, as to what might happen. All the crap that comes flying at you during the day, when you've meditated, it's like your Tefal. It's just like bounces off you. You're like, oh, whatever. And it just, and then you can keep the focus. Don't engage with it.
That's the thing. Having again, we'll talk about the film later, but just having that, you get a glimpse of what it might like to be famous. And someone like Richard Armitage, you know, is in, you know, being in a show like Spooks or The Hobbit or what have you, that if you wallow in, you know, if you allow yourself to wallow in that kind of adoration, it can be very, very distracting. And it's like someone tapping on the shoulder every couple of minutes. And you kind of think, no, I've got to put all that aside. Way. And whatever it is, you know, it's in your life, everyone has distractions. Everyone has things they need to put aside. So you need to find a way to do it. And I mean, actors as well, they're taught, you know, Alexander technique, all of these techniques to center and become still. Especially if you're a film actor, stillness is a real skill. That from, you know, just posture, stillness, breathing. Actors learn all of these things. Mm-hmm. You know, my wife did it when she was at drama school. George is learning this stuff now. My son is studying acting at Chichester. It's all you're learning how to, you know, just focus in on yourself.
Yeah. I've got a technique that I've developed over many years of actually, weird enough, it came out of doing group coaching, and I was getting people showing up at 4:00 in the morning in Australia, people in the UK rushing on the underground to get to the 8:00 session, and then people somewhere in the middle, you know, having lunch. And I had to ground everyone together because everyone was like in a different headspace. And so I developed this breathing technique, which I'll actually introduce it, because we'll try it out, because it's what it is it's basically a technique for people that have tried meditation, it doesn't work for them, or they don't have time to meditate. So it's it's very easily adapted to writing as well. So offline, we'll maybe do a little bit of, I'll give you the kind of process that you go through. It's very, very simple. And but I think, Mark, we should go on.
Listeners, if next week I'm talking like a robot, you'll know that he's got to me.
I'm kind of like, it's my evil laugh. But I actually think this is a really interesting, I think a lot of writers don't talk about it, but I know a lot of writers do use techniques such as meditation to get into the right headspace to write. The minute we open this door, honestly, the amount of people that will start, I mean, we're going to get a ton of people who are going to just respond to just this conversation now going, I meditate every day and this really helped me.
I mean, I know writers too. I mean, there's a writer I know called Mark Chadbourne who swears by it, you know,
right.
And he's very successable. He's the guy who's now basically writing Wilbur Smith's books, you know.
Wow.
So, and it's I'm just finding that it's, especially in this multimedia world where we're bombarded with stuff from left, right, and centre. I think there's a lot to be said for taking a moment.
It's like having a tool, having a technique. We're going to do a whole episode on this, Mark, because it's a biggie. But down the road. But maybe we'll just put it out there. If you've got any experiences yourself in, maybe you were struggling, you tried meditation and it's really helped, or a form of that, we want to hear from you, because that'd be really interesting to kind of explore this, because it is a very important thing that a lot of people don't discuss. So I'll be interested to see where this goes, Mr. Stay. I'm glad that you're open to trying it out. I think that's actually the most important thing. Most people, they poo-poo stuff like this and they just think, oh, it's a bit weird and it's a bit like new agey, but it isn't. It's like, it's becoming scientifically mainstream now. I mean, your doctor basically prescribes it instead of taking, antidepressants for many people now. Initially, is a first, it's very, very mainstream, and I think it's time to explore it in more detail for writers. I think it'd be a really valuable discussion.
We'll see. Watch this space.
Yeah, excellent stuff. Brilliant. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of treatments and this idea of detailed. I mean, he said detailed outlines, and I was desperate for you to ask. How many words was your outline, Richard?
I didn't want to dare. No, I didn't dare ask. I mean, to be honest, it's that came up at the Ben Aronovich event as well.
Of course, it will forever.
Haunt me to my dying day.
It will haunt you to your dying day. It'll be on your epitaph. How many words? That'll be your epitaph.
But he's taking Richard is taking that film and TV approach to it. That is pretty much how you pitch something for TV. You might put together a treatment and a detailed outline. And what I thought was interesting was that he referred to call sheets for a shoot. For TV and film. Now, what happens with a call sheet? You get you might be doing 5 or 6 setups during a day, maybe more, maybe less, depending on who what scenes you're doing. So it will say, let's see if I can dig out some from Unwelcome. Actually, I don't know if I'm allowed to share them, but you would get the call sheet every day. You say, right, here's who's coming on the set, and here are the scenes that we're shooting, and you get the slug line. So it'd be exterior, house, day, whatever, which doesn't really tell you much. Tells you the location, what the lighting's going to be like. But then you'd have X and Y meet A and B, and there's an argument, blah blah blah. So you have that very pithy synopsis of the drama of that moment. And I think from Richard's point of view, because he's someone who is juggling many projects as an actor, it's a very handy shorthand for him to get back into it. So if he's off shooting a film or a TV show and he's got to come back to his novel, he's already got a lot of story being jumbling about in his head. So he needs to look at a page and go, right, what am I looking at now? Oh, we're doing that. Okay. Because the other thing as well, it's a very actor way of thinking. And again, we'll talk about this more in the extended version, but when you're an actor, when you shoot film and TV, it's often shot out of sequence, because you do everything at one location, then you move to another, and it's often non-chronological. So you do a scene, and the first question you often ask is, okay, what came before and what came after? What's my in? What's my out? And what am I feeling now? What I've just been told, that my brother has betrayed me, and now I'm confronting him for the scene. And the next scene, I push him off a bridge or whatever. So it gives you a kind of an emotional context of what you're going to do in that moment. So it's interesting that that's the kind of methodical way that he approached storytelling. And I think, again, if you're a writer listening to this and thinking that's an interesting way of approaching it, that's how actors approach. Often, particularly if they're working in film and TV, that's how they approach each scene, because it's all done in tiny little bits out of sequence. Sometimes, you hear about films where, you have a 2-shot and there's an actor A is talking to actor B, and they may have been shot months apart because actor A wasn't available at the time, but they did those bits with actor A while they had him and all the lights set up, and actor B, she came in and did the cutaways. So
is it also? I want to ask a question about this, because I remember in the movie Unwelcome, there are a number of different pub scenes, of which a certain friend of mine appears in quite a lot. Actually, it's absolutely marvelous. I know that guy.
Yes, I'll have the role of man in pub is completely essential to the plot.
It is. There's one moment I thought you were going to jump in there and start beefing someone, but it was brilliant. But there were 3 particular scenes, I think, that were kind of like chronologically split. But of course, once you've got that pub set up and you've got the lighting set up and all the actors there, I'm assuming that's why a lot of things are shot out of order, because you just need to shoot all the pub scenes in one go. Is that typically how it works?
Absolutely, yeah. We only had that pub for a couple of days.
Okay.
I think it was all done in 2 days.
Right. So it's almost out of necessity they have to do that.
Absolutely,
from a budgeting perspective and obviously logistics. I think this is an interesting thing for writers to explore, though, because I think we can get a little bit, well, I think it obviously makes sense for us to write in a chronological order. It can be hard writing chapter 18 after you've written chapter 1. But for people that are struggling with their book and they've got to a point in it where they're stuck, I've heard this, a lot of people have said, haven't they, in the podcast over the years, sometimes it just helps to get out of your own head space, is to just jump ahead and just pick a scene. And it doesn't matter if it doesn't work, but it just like allow yourself to just fast forward and go and write chapter 18 and then come back to chapter 12.
It's a great solution. You know, write the thing that you've been looking forward to, that big confrontation, write the ending if you want, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe just focus on one character, you know, and follow them through their story.
And you've got something then to focus towards then. You've got a stake you've got a point in the ground.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely.
Like when you're doing
but the other thing is, very often by doing that, it might unlock something that gives you a solution to the thing that you were stuck on before.
Do you want to hear a really, really dodgy analogy? Mowing lawns.
Okay.
Right? Have you ever tried to mow the lawn and you kind of look at the mower and you try to get a straight line? It doesn't work. You're all over the place. But if you pick a point, if you pick the point you're heading to and you just trust in it and you go, it's like you get a perfect straight line. And it's almost like if you can get that in your book, if you can get that point in the future and you just keep your eye on it, just head towards it, everything will be fine. You won't get wobbly.
It's a good analogy. I like that one.
There you go. We'll bank that one, I think. Yeah. Let's now talk about this idea, Mark, of editors and directors. I love this insight that Richard, who's obviously a great actor, and he can kind of he sees the world differently from a person who's just come directly into writing. But the way in which he compared an editor to a director, this idea he talked about being able to be molded as a writer, and also the ability to allow yourself to yield to things. Yeah. That was a brilliant analogy, because a lot of writers struggle with that. They don't realize that that's part of what the editor's job is, to be like the potter and shape and mold you into the writer you can become.
Yeah, I mean, there's a slight difference, but when I'm writing scripts, particularly when I'm working with John Wright, who did Unwelcome, I see myself very much as a service provider. He's the person who stands on set with the sides, which are the little bits of script that you have when you're shooting, and he has to have complete mastery of it. He has to understand every word on that page. So if we're in the script edit stage and he's like, why has this character said this? Why is this happening? What's this conflict about? I have to be able to answer that. I can't just go, well, because I think it's good and I think it should stay in because I'm a genius or whatever. That's not good enough. You know, he needs to have complete understanding of it. And similarly, an editor is in many ways, I mean, I know we have alpha readers, beta readers and what have you, but they are ultimately your first reader in a professional sense. I think they're the one who, at a publisher, or if you're self-publishing, they're often the last reader before it goes out to the real world. So they are they're quality control. They're saying, okay, you've got this thing here and it doesn't make sense, or it's a bit extraneous, or is it a bit self-indulgent? Do you really need it? And so, yeah, it's a similar thing where it's someone just going, quality control. Are you absolutely sure? Is this earning its keep? Is this a hill that you're willing to die on? And so it is a negotiation, as Richard said. And sometimes, yeah, you have to yield. You have to go, yeah, okay, you've got me. That's fine. That's one of my bad habits. I'll put that away and just put it in the next book. Yeah.
And he also said as well, this challenge of personal things that you've put into your novel, the editor does not know about. And in some ways, you need somebody to be emotionally detached from your journey in the story. Not emotionally detached from, obviously, the story and the characters. They have to be emotionally attached to that. But they need to not know what is personal, because they will then be able to filter out what's of value in that you put in, and what is just you kind of, adding, the opposite of what Stephen King, adding your darlings in, like keeping those things that are are really important to you, but maybe don't add to the story or don't mean anything, and they don't have that impact that they do in your own life. And
and
that's the editor's job.
sometimes those things can be really difficult to get rid of, because often you'll find that they might be the thing that inspired you in the first place. There might be a line that you heard or a character that you love who has helped you develop the story, but has the project has overtaken them. Or they've outlived their usefulness, and now it's time for them to go.
Yeah,
and there's a part of you that
purpose.
has, exactly. But you still have that emotional link to it, and it's important to you. But the reader doesn't give two figs, and the reader will go, "What's this about? What's this thing?" So sometimes it has to go, and it's often the toughest thing to let go of.
Absolutely. So, folks, if you've enjoyed this little chat, we've got a lot more to talk about. If you want to join us in the extended edition, we're going to talk about the idea of writing a book audio first, the idea of like thinking about it as an audiobook. We're going to talk about music and writing. Oh, that's music to my ears. You know, the idea of Richard talked about some amazing things around, you know, drumming and pacing when you write. We're going to delve into the challenge of using different accents. I love the analogy of him talking about planting seeds as well, which, you know, as a gardener myself, I just love. We're also going to talk a little bit about choosing emotion over plot, the idea about loose ends. We're going to dive into the idea of something called method writing, which we're going to dive into. And that's worth it alone. I think that's going to be a fascinating discussion. And we're also going to talk about the idea of grief, which is very relevant today. An idea of grief when you finish a book is something that it's very important to talk about and acknowledge. So if you would love to join us for another 20, 30 minutes of extended edition of this podcast, plus Mark chatting about and my experiences in Leicester Square with the Unwelcome, pop along to bestsellerexperiment.com/support, sign up as a patron, or join the Academy where you get all of the extended versions as part of the content there. Welcome to the extended edition of this podcast, and we have so much to get through, Mark. Let's crack straight in. So I found it fascinating that this idea of thinking about writing from an audiobook perspective. It's a very new thing, really, in the big scheme of publishing over hundreds of years. But from an actor's perspective and a dialogue perspective, it really changes, I think, the way that you approach writing the book, doesn't it?
Dialogue, rhythm, tone, all of these things, especially if you are going audio first, it is a different approach, and I think it's interesting to compare. Actually, we should talk to Ian Sainsbury about this because I know he's done at least one audio original for Audible as well, and how that might have changed his writing. But it's different when you know you're going to have to narrate it. I think one of the common notes, because Julian Barr edits my short stories, and possibly the most common note I get from Julian is, think of the poor audio narrator when.
Interesting.
You will write sentences that look good on the page, but when you try and read them out loud, you can trip over yourself. They can be too long. They can be alliterations that can be clumsy, and it's one of the best bits of advice I ever got from someone was from Pandora White, who was the former audiobooks director at Orion. And she said she wished more writers would read their novel out loud before sending it into their publisher, because so many times in an audiobook recording, they discover typos, things that didn't make sense, sentences that, just rambled on. So I've always done that. I've, certainly with the Woodville books, I've done that before I've turned it in. And, even then, I went to the audiobook recording of Ghost of Ivy Barn, and while I was there, Candida, the narrator, she found a typo, and I was like, "Oh my god, how many times have I read this book? There's still a typo." Yeah. But I think I have far fewer than most because I do that.
You read it out, yeah. Well, also the thing that we forget as writers is we're all so obsessed with the written word, the text on the page, but actually, if you think about it, when we all read a book, what we're actually doing is we're converting that text into a voice in our head. And we are all audiobook narrators in many ways when we read. And so we should all be doing that, because that's the actual experience the reader's getting. And maybe that is one of the secrets to a successful book, is the fact that it translates well to that voice in our head. And it's almost like we should, I mean, not push the text secondary, but the text is just a conversion mechanism for the voice. Because I mean, I'm not wrong here, right? Everyone must have that voice in their heads when they're reading.
Not everyone does.
Really?
Apparently
That's
not.
Bonkers. But how does that work, though? How do you hear the book? How do you hear the story?
But this is the thing. We
need to investigate this.
The more I'm sure we had an author on here who was like that. But it's the more we discover about the brain, the more amazing it is. But apparently there are, and it's fairly common, people who have no internal monologue in their head, whereas me, I can't get them to shut up.
Well, exactly. Me too, right?
The voice is in my head,
especially at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. So not everyone is. I mean, I was talking to someone the other day whose daughter has synesthesia, where they see when you speak, they see the words as color. And they see music as color.
Oh,
they see music as color. So, and they'll go, they'll listen to music and they'll go, well, that's blue. How do you? So they are seeing the world in a completely different way from the rest of us. Yeah. But anyway, look, if you're writing, don't get hung up on that. Because if there's anything that's gonna, if there's anything
rainbow
that's
writing,
in your writing,
nightmare. I think it's also important. I think I'd be curious to know what percentage of people have the voice, because I'm assuming it. I mean, in my own mind, I would assume it's like way in the high 90s, which again makes it really relevant in terms of speaking your novel out. And you probably learn a lot about, where stuff is clunky. I know that you've said that
Absolutely.
in the past. It just jumps out for you, doesn't it? It's like, oh, that just doesn't. And even actually I've done a lot of speech writing as well. And I do that with speeches. I say them out loud and I'm like, oh yeah, that doesn't, it kind of like your tongue gets tied.
And as Rich was saying, dialogue is something that, particularly as an audiobook narrator and as an actor, I mean, there's the great line from Harrison Ford when they were shooting Star Wars. He turned to George Lucas and he said, "You can type this shit, George, but you can't say it." And so he would often rejig the lines, which is why I think Harrison Ford has all the best lines in Star Wars, because it's true. It's absolutely true. It looks fine on the page, but I urge people to at least read it out loud, or take an acting course, or talk to some actors about this kind of stuff. He mentioned a couple of books there. So David Mamet, True and False. And I was looking for a copy, and I've just remembered I've given it to my son, who's acting, and he's away at uni at the moment, because I said to him, this is one of the best books on acting ever. And it talks about learning the lines, understanding the lines, and then delivering them truthfully. And it's a quite a hectoring book, and it is quite divisive. But I absolutely loved it. And Mamet loved Harold Pinter, and I dug out my old copy of The Caretaker, which I studied at school. Harold Pinter's The Caretaker, and I went to see it. It's got all my little notes in the margin, stuff like that. But the thing that Pinter does, and Mamet does it as well, is people will stop just before they say the important thing. And sometimes Mamet puts it in parentheses. So if you get some of his plays or screenplays, you will see unspoken dialogue. So they will say, I don't know, for example, they may say something like, "So you're having an affair with Susan." But what they might only, so the name with Susan might be in parentheses. So they might go, "You're having an affair with," and it's just inferred, and it's that thing of Harold Pinter, people, that's a really bad example actually, but it's that Harold Pinter thing of people exhibit characteristics they don't tell you. They don't wear their heart on their sleeve. They will exhibit. So in The Caretaker, there are lots of little hints about the character of what's his name, Davies, who's basically like an old tramp. And there are little bits of dialogue in there, good luck, little things like that, where you go, oh, that's what a tramp might say. So it's telling me something about, and then you get bits of Welsh dialogue in there. You think, oh, he's got a Welsh background. Okay, so you are slowly learning about him without him explaining it to you. If that I'm doing this really badly, but it's all that thing of concealing what we feel, not saying out loud what we feel. Sometimes you have to, but to engage a reader, sometimes you just need to stop just before you get to the important bit and trust the reader to add two and two and come to that conclusion together. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So now let's talk about this idea of music and writing. This hasn't really come up much. There's a lot of people that do music and write. I mean, there's tons, aren't there? Tons. I mean, Richard, again, he talks about being a musician, didn't he? But this idea of, I love this analogy of this idea of thinking musically for your writing in terms of pacing, rhythm. He talked about this idea of speeding up the rhythm of the words as the action builds. Fascinating approach. And we probably all do it naturally to some extent, but thinking like a musician, I think, can really help us focus on that.
Yeah, light and shade, And again, if you are one of these people who has problems with pacing in your fiction, sometimes it's as simple as sentence length. If you're writing sentences that all have the same length, that's actually really exhausting for the reader. And it's something that if you're an audiobook narrator, you'll really notice as well. So look at mixing up short sentences, long sentences, breaking them up, breaking line breaks, paragraph breaks, using that white space on the page as well. All of that stuff really makes a huge difference to how it's read out loud, but also in the reader's mind as well. It does little things to give little beats, little breaks, and allow you to take a breath. So yeah, it's really important.
Yeah. Now, there's a great gardening analogy that Richard used, which is this idea of allowing yourself to plant seeds, and also knowing that in nature, some of the seeds are going to come up and give you something beneficial, a harvest of sorts, and others won't ever come up, but it's still important to plant them. And I think I love this. I mean, obviously I love gardening, so that anything gardening analogies, I'm always all in with. But I also think it's a very important thing for writers to allow themselves to plant ideas that might not come to fruition, because we always think that everything's got to have some natural process or a start, middle, and end, every single idea we throw in there. And I think, no, let's leave it to nature in our book in some ways to kind of decide what comes up later, and allow ourselves to explore. And it kind of, I think, goes back to this idea of experimenting with things, put things in the ground, see what comes up, but don't think, I failed, because and in gardening, your missus will know this, right? What percentage of seeds actually come up? I mean, you don't need many.
But it's also a thing of writing without fear. And I think this is why a lot of people get stuck around about 20, 30,000 words into their book, because that's where you need to start making story choices that have consequences. So you think, if I put this thing in, does this mean I'm stuck with this? Does this mean I have to see this through to the end? And you don't know unless you try it. So I will do this a lot. I will, you come across an idea and you think, that's cool. Or is that going to completely derail things? Well, let's give it a go. And I think you will always discover something about the story. Even if you don't use it, you've discovered how not to do something. But 9 times out of 10, you discover something that you can carry forward.
Yes.
So even if it might not, become into a full-blown character or plot thread or whatever, it will have something in there that you can use later on.
Actually, just taking the analogy a little bit further, what gardeners do, if they're planting, say, tomatoes, they will plant 2 or 3 or even 4 seeds and see which ones come up. And then the ones that do come up, they then pluck out the weakest ones and allow the strongest one to then enjoy that space. And I think the reason writers need to do that is this idea of, you can actually throw in 3 or 4 different ideas and then allow them time to kind of to grow, and then try and be as objective as possible and stand back and say, which ones are the weak ones, which one looking a bit spindly, pluck them out. And then by giving the space to that one that's really coming through, then that becomes the most healthiest of all of the ideas. So it gives you a sense of being able to compare and contrast. Whereas if you just have one seed, if it comes up, great, but you have no idea if that was the strongest of the 4 seeds. So
You're listening to Gardener's Question Time.
It is. Do you know what? I've been on Gardener's Question Time.
Oh, of course you have.
No, absolute bonkers. No, it's true. I went weirdly enough. So and again, all this kind of like love of gardening is because I've been doing it for a number of years, and I set this charity up called Food Share, and we were invited onto Gardeners Question Time. They happened to be doing a live show in Linton in the middle of Cambridgeshire, and we got invited along, and it was like, and all the old classic. It was about 10 years ago. It had all the classic presenters. The longest running radio show in the world, I believe, and it still gets millions of listeners every week. Absolute phenomenon. So anyone listening outside of the UK, well, mind you, BBC, you can get everywhere now. But if you like gardening, Gardener's Question Time, it's about as English, British as you can get.
Yeah, but it's not as good as Claire's Allotment on YouTube. That's much better.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's the new generation, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
like the Question Time of the. But yeah, random thought. I'd completely forgot about that. But yeah, anyway, gardening analogies, love them. All right, Richard also talked about this idea of breaking into a lab. I love this. Like putting on a coat, walking in and just milling around in Cambridge University. Firstly, you think, oh, security, but you can do that. You can. I lived in Cambridge like for 15 years. You can wander into like any one of the number of buildings and just like hang out. But it got me thinking about, as an actor, he's obviously very much focused. I mean, he talked about how important it is for him to get the backstory of the character and this idea of method acting. And what this idea reminds me of is something that we've never really given a name to. This idea of method writing is this idea of, we talked about research, but, going and experience, the mountainside in the middle of the Himalayas and all the rest of it. Michelle Paver, I think that was. So we do want to immerse ourselves in the world of where our character or where our setting is. But giving it a name of something like method writing allows us as writers to be a bit like actors and go and immerse ourselves.
In fact, last night it was Ben Aronovich who said, you can't write about the desert till you've smelled a camel. Although he said, basically he said he only had to go to London Zoo. But, and I know there is Ben's a great one because I think his next book he was telling us is set in Aberdeen. So he's been going up to Aberdeen and he's learned so much by going there. And that, obviously not all of us can do that. We can't, if we've set a book in the Himalayas, we can't be like Michelle Paver and go and camp in the Himalayas necessarily. It's going to be tricky. And Google Street View can be very handy with these kind of things. But if you can go the extra mile, it does often pay off. And, it can be as simple as dressing as we had Christian Cameron on here and also Simon Scarrow talking about putting on the historical outfits of soldiers from ancient Greece or ancient Rome, and then you discover things about them when you're wearing it. It's like, actually, it's really difficult to move in this, or they get dirty really quickly, and these things keep coming loose, and little details like that add those little touches, those little grace notes of authenticity that make all the difference, that make the reader feel they're really there. So it is always worth making the effort and taking a leaf from an actor's, and it's not even method actors. I think it's just part of an actor's due diligence. If you're playing a surgeon, you need to look like you know what you're doing. So they will spend time with surgeons looking at how they hold a scalpel and the way they speak to people and the way they move and the way that they carry themselves. Same if you're playing a cop or any of those professions. So it's definitely worth doing, a level of research. I think it's all part of your due diligence I love the phrase you use, which is know, don't show as well, because it comes back to that thing we were talking about earlier of just exhibiting characteristics rather than explaining yourself. So if as an actor, if you internalize it and you're looking at someone and in your head you're thinking, I hate you or I love you, you're not pulling faces, you're not gurning, you're internalizing it. And by internalizing it, you are subconsciously giving up, particularly on film where you're on a massive screen, and the slightest flicker has a huge impact on how people register emotion. That kind of internalization is really, really important. So think about what things your characters are holding back, what they're refusing to impart, what secrets they're sitting on, and how they would exhibit that physically. There's a great series of videos, and they're on YouTube now, of Michael Caine talking about acting in film, and little things like don't blink, but also the drunk tries to act sober. If you go, I'm a drunk, and then that's but a real drunk will try and be as sober as possible because they don't want you to know that they're drunk. So little things like that. So yeah, I do urge people to at least watch the Michael Caine thing, study acting to an extent. Do a part in a local play. You'll learn so much. Make a short film. Just write take a scene from your book, script it as a 5-minute short film, shoot it on your phone with a couple of actor friends or whatever. You'll learn so much just from doing that,
and have an absolute blast as well.
Oh, I bet. Yeah.
Richard also talked about this idea of not having to tie up loose ends, which, going back to the seed analogy of planting ideas and allowing some of them to fail and pick the strongest. I think at the other end of that analogy, we've got this idea of, if you do plant some seeds, if you do have some ideas germinating and generating, you don't have to neatly tie your book in a bow by the final page. And I love the idea because that's the bit for me when I come away from either a book or a movie and I'm thinking about it, because we all do. We all have that kind of post, the post reflection of the film or the book. And I love it actually when there's stuff that isn't unfinished, because it allows me to then be my own storyteller and think, I wonder what happened there. I wonder if this would happen. Or I wonder if he's left that open or she's left that open in order to develop that plot line in the next book in the series or the next, film in the trilogy. And I think it's sometimes a gift to allow people to do that, but it's also nice as well, because as an author, you can just chuck in stuff as red herrings as well, with no intention whatsoever of allowing it to develop and maybe take people down a different path. But it extends the life of the book and the film beyond the end, the final page or the end credits, doesn't it?
Yes, I think if it's done with intent, I think there are. I think every story has plot holes. I don't think there's a single story out there that doesn't have a plot hole. Every story has one. Even stories you tell about. This is the thing. If I was to tell you an anecdote about something that happened to me the other day, you might go, well, why did they do that? That doesn't make sense. And you go, that's life, but in story, we expect structure. We expect a story to have a beginning, middle, and end, and we want to be satisfied by that ending. We want some kind of synthesis at the end that explains, summarizes in some way what we've just seen. But what a lot of people think is, that means the plot has to slot together like a jigsaw puzzle, particularly if you're writing a crime thriller or something that has an element of a puzzle to it. It all needs to make sense and interlock. But actually, the more important thing is to make sure it makes some kind of emotional sense. Okay, so there are many, many films where there will be plot holes, but as long as you're emotionally satisfied by it, then it's succeeded. So if it thrills you, if it makes you cry, if it makes you laugh, but the plot hasn't necessarily made sense, then kind of who cares? This isn't an exercise in logic. Storytelling is telling a story of change of a character and a huge upheaval in the character's life. And that's always an emotional roller coaster. So for me, I always choose emotion over plot. I always, try and move the reader and in a way that will hopefully, affect them in a way that might help them, in their own lives or whatever. So I think that's whenever I hear people go on about, plot holes or even just little things, especially in movies where people go about continuity errors. I remember coming, these things infuriate me. These things on YouTube where they go, 10 mistakes in, in Goodfellas or whatever. I remember there's a scene in Goodfellas where he's in prison and his wife is there and their children are there. And they're having this intense conversation. And because they've got children, they've got toys and alphabet bricks on the table between them. And in every shot, the alphabet bricks are completely different. They've moved around, because the kids are going, I'm going to move that there, move that there. And people go, I hope someone got fired for that. And it's like, it's like, that is not the purpose of the scene. The purpose of the scene is these two people trying to sort out their lives while he's in prison and she's fearing for her life and the lives of her children. That's what it's about. It's about the emotion. It's not about the frickin' blocks, so it really, really infuriates me when people pick up on stuff like that. Yeah. So, always emotion over plot, and it's definitely over continuity.
It does make me wonder if anyone watching this video, the extended version of the podcast, have noticed my headphones have changed.
Yay!
We'll just throw that one in there. Put that one on your YouTube video. Not that anyone cares whatsoever.
I hope someone got fired for that.
I hope someone got fired for that. I hope someone got fired for the poor battery life in the other set. But anyway, rewind, you see what I mean? Brilliant. One thing I want to just throw in there, just because it's too good a line to not reference, and it's like, I just want to throw it in there because I want to go away and think about this now for the next couple of days because it's so brilliant, and I never thought of this, and it's so bloody obvious. Richard said, if you're in a horror movie, you don't know you're in a horror movie.
Yes.
I'm just like mind blown. I'm like, God, of course. Like it's one of those truisms that as a writer, you need to realise that your characters don't know they're in thrillers. They're just having a really crappy day that's going AWOL and they're wondering why someone's chasing them. It's like, but as a writer, we're like, oh yes, I've got this character and I'm going to throw him into this scene and it's going to be all, and we're writing like, I'm a thriller writer. It's like the characters don't know that. They're just trying to get about and have a normal day in their life and everything's going AWOL.
And that's a really important thing to remember because that character will have a goal that they're trying to achieve. And that goal might be just to get through the day or to meet someone or whatever. And the action, the plot, is pulling them away from that. Yeah. So that resistance is drama. That's the conflict. That's the thing that's driving the story. So that's a really, really important thing to remember. And the character will just be trying to do the thing that helps them get through the day. So there will be that resisting the call. There will be that, I don't want to do that. I don't want to risk anything. But you, as the writer, have to push and prod them and test them until they snap and do something and take action and have agency. And that's all good storytelling.
It's great, isn't it? Now we're coming to the end. We're coming to the end of this extended edition. And I'm feeling a little bit of grief around this, Mark. But Richard said, and this is great, and this is really relevant, you come to the end of your book. You've lived with your characters for weeks, months, maybe years in many cases. End of a 7-book series. I mean, God, what must that be like? That must be like Lord of the Rings cast times 7 or 3 or whatever it might be. Because there is this grief around having to leave and end something that you've lived with for so long, and people don't talk about that really. It's the first time actually I heard that come up on the podcast. Richard talked about, wanting this desperation. And I wonder if that's partly come from his experiences of maybe being on the set with, his Hobbit, fellow cast members, and they lived together in this life for God knows how many years. I remember seeing the end of the Lord of the Rings DVD extras where they, it was the final shoot.
Yeah,
and it was
they all got tattoos. They all got tattoos, didn't they?
The tears and knowing that this group of actors will never, ever all be together in the same place at the same time, and it's like this knowing that this journey has come to an end, and you invest yourself as a writer, and it must feel like that for everyone.
Well, you form a bond with people, and I think you form a bond with your characters. I mean, Back to Reality's 5 years old. I still think about Jo. And
wondering how she's doing.
The week that we're recording this, The End of Magic is 4 years old. And someone mentioned it on Twitter today and said, I wonder what they're up to, these characters. And I thought,
really?
yeah, they did.
Interesting.
And I do the same. I kind of, and because basically when the book is 5 years old, I can get the rights back and maybe write a sequel or whatever. Because there is every now and then I'm thinking, what? because that was a very open-ended ending. I wrote it as a standalone, but there's a door open for more adventures or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
So I do think, and we could set it 5 years later, and what's changed and what are they up to? And I miss old, Roisin and Sander and what's going on with those guys? So you do. They're like friends you had an intense relationship with, and then they buggered off.
Brilliant stuff. Well, that brings us to the end of the extended edition for the podcast, but we're going to do an extended edition. I'm thinking of it, Mark, to be honest. I'm thinking of it more like a mini deep dive. It can always be a
therapy session.
A therapy session. Yeah. So pop yourself on the couch, Mark, and make yourself comfortable, because I'm going to talk about my experience with Leicester Square next week, because I think that would be a fun thing to do prior to the intro for the because that's a whole different story. But firstly, I've got to say, we have journeyed together. It feels like we're kind of Siamese twins in a weird way. Like from the minute that you had this idea for the movie Unwelcome, I remember us talking about, I've come up with this idea and it's kind of a bit crazy, goblins, and we've journeyed through all of the insane ups and downs of this movie, and we finally came to honestly, to get to that point, I think it's just bonkers. I think I wrote a piece actually in the Academy newsletter about it. Like, to get to that moment where the film actually was released was amazing, considering everything that was thrown at it, with COVID, with cinemas closing, with due dates being, release dates being shifted, and we got to this date finally in January where the film came out. And I was in the UK. I'd gone to see it, obviously, and we were texting a lot, weren't we, in the lead up to it and around it. And I'm just curious, like, as a kind of and it's not really a post-mortem, because I don't think we've really started. I don't think this journey of the movie has really started. But I'm kind of curious as to where you're at with things, kind of checking in with you about, like, what was your experience of it? And, bit of a behind the scenes as to what was going on for you.
It's difficult to talk about it without sounding like a completely ungrateful scrote. Because as you say, we finished filming it over 2.5 years ago now, and you wait all that time, and it got delayed because of COVID and then Omicron, and then it comes out now. Warner Brothers put it in over 300 cinemas, but there was no marketing. There were no posters. Why? I don't know. You'd have to ask someone there. But when you see posters on the side of a bus, that's usually a marketing spend of between £1 million, £2 million. So I guess they figured we're not going to spend money on that. So it came out, and basically no one went to see it. So it's
well, it came out in the UK. We should specify. It's a UK release in January.
Yeah. So over 300 cinemas, and it's, did make the top 10, took about 150 grand at the box office. So a disappointment, but it was always doomed if you don't put the marketing and advertising behind it. So why did they do it? I don't know. You'd have to ask them.
I did see a Twitter post that somebody said, after all of the promotion for a year ago, and I wonder if there was more promotion done on the original release date, maybe.
There was a trailer, because it was originally going to come October 2021, right. I think. There was a trailer sort of gearing everything towards that, and then they bumped it again. So, after all that build-up, 36 hours into the opening weekend, we knew it was dead on arrival. Wow. And I had this big existential crisis because I've been working on stuff for 2 years other scripts and TV shows and things like that in anticipation of this moment, so I can go, ta-da! And suddenly I'm the guy who's had, 2 flops essentially. And so, I'm thinking, oh God, am I ever going to be able to do this again? Is this, but then let's put this into context. So you very kindly said, look, I'm going to Leicester Square with some mates, old school friends of mine, and yours. Do you want to come along? And I completely wussed out, because I had my magic moment at the Sidges Film Festival in Spain, where we had a fantastic preview. Audience loved it, 1,400 seater. And with respect to the patrons at the View in Leicester Square, I didn't want to be sitting there with, people munching on popcorn, checking their social media, because it'd just be too stressful. And to put this in context, Mr. D had just gone through one of the great traumas of life, and he's having a great time. He's coping, and I'm the one going, no, don't. And also, what listeners don't know is Mr. D was shielding me from the reviews because I didn't dare go in and check the reviews. And he was very kindly sending me the good ones. So, again,
of which there were many.
Yeah, thank you. And we're fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. We're registered fresh. We're 73%. So I'm very happy with that. But I was a complete wuss, and thank you for seeing me through that, because it's like that first night. I could see a hashtag trending, unwelcome movie. Because we had a preview on the Tuesday. That was it. So people were talking about it. And it was like standing on a diving. You remember the Leatherhead Leisure Centre?
I do. I was just thinking Leatherhead Leisure Centre, the
top
pool.
diving board. Yeah,
which I remember that.
When you're a teenager, you just go flying off.
Yeah, but when you're 8 years old, you look down and you think, bloody hell! I remember
in addition to that, it's like you're looking at you're at the top of the, and you're looking down at the social media swimming pool below. Okay, and you don't know what's in the water. It's a bit murky because you haven't jumped in yet. And in the water, there could be those little fish that nibble at your toes and take all the dead skin off and make you feel good. Okay. There could be, or there could be piranhas. Okay. Mm-hmm. So and I sat there with my phone. It was like 11 o'clock at night. I'm thinking, do I jump in? And I thought, oh, sod it, I'll jump in. So I had a look. And I remember it was a cathartic moment, a truly cathartic moment, because some people hated it, and some people loved it. And
it was incredible, wasn't it? Like you used the word Marmite, didn't you?
Yeah,
it was absolutely the Marmite effect.
Yeah. Interestingly, what's happened since then is more people are liking it than hate. Because that preview night, people go along, they have no clue what it's about. Yeah. And it just might not be their kind of movie. And actually, ever since, people are going, basically the general feedback has been, tonally it's all over the place. The ending is batshit crazy. And you either love that or you don't. Yeah. And it did occur to me as well, we have made a strange film. It is a peculiar film. It doesn't, it doesn't obey a lot of the rules that you might expect, and it takes some left, which I'm very proud of. And, and the intent was there.
I think, because you kind of draw people in at the beginning, and you kind of watching the movie for the first 45 minutes. You're like, it's really fascinating, but you don't see what's coming. It's just completely. I mean, I can imagine someone with no knowledge that some stuff comes out of the woods at the back of the house. You're just sitting there going, "What just happened?" And that to me is part of the magic of the film. And but I think I want to put this into context as well, because I think part of the challenge as well, from everything that you've journeyed with it, the waiting, the anticipation, the build up, we're still going, now we've got another release date, and that constant, it would be really hard in a way, after all of that waiting, to have a moment where you're like, and this is the climax, and it absolutely blew away all my expectations, right? Because it's just you've been waiting so long. But I have this really, and I said this to you, didn't I, when we were kind of texting around the days, I said, there's something about this film that it's success and we have to put quotes around the word success, because I think the fact the film came out means, in my book, it's a complete success. I mean, what's happened at the box office initially, and we're only a few weeks, well, not even a couple of weeks in, but what's happened might not be the full story, because I think with some films, they need time to kind of go on the word of mouth. And I think this, and I do think, and I said this to you, didn't I? I said, it obviously massively helps if you've got a massive amount of advertising and it huge marketing budget, and it gives it a massive launch. But I've seen time and time again, whether it's music careers or anything else, it doesn't matter how much marketing you throw at it. It ultimately will live or die on whether people recommend it to other people. And I've just got a sense that once this film goes to the States, being a British movie and being the insanity that it is, it's got all the hallmarks of becoming like in that genre of film where people are going to have parties where they invite their mates around on a Friday night and they're all going to like be mouthing, they're going to do the words. They're going to be, it's going to be like, it's
Silly
like,
Billy.
and I don't, yes, I know. I don't want to use the word cult classic because it's a little bit of a trope, but for me, it's got all the hallmarks of becoming that. So I think it's like you said, obviously if it had come out the gate and been the number one film that week, would have been absolutely fantastic.
Well,
I don't think the story's over.
Maybe I've answered my own question there, because we did make a strange film, which makes it difficult to market, and maybe that's why Warner's decided not to bother. And these are big financial stakes, so you can't blame them in some ways. And people do keep telling me, "You've made a cult classic." Now, that's a badge of honor, I guess. Time will tell, that kind of thing. But it does make my immediate employment quite dodgy.
Well, I guess, from the perspective of with all of the things you've got ready in the wings, ready to go, obviously. But that might come a little bit down the road now. Well, like I say, we've still got America to come. Now, America isn't a wide release. I think it's quite a small release because it's coming out in theaters on the 10th, and it's on Shudder. I think it's on Shudder on the 14th. So you got 4 days. Right.
But I think that I have no idea where it's actually being released, but already the company is distributing it in the States. It's called Wellgo, and they're doing stuff on social media where they're digging into Irish folklore mythology as if they're saying, okay, this is stuff you haven't heard of. You might not be familiar with this, but here's the history behind it. So get in the mood.
I think that's great.
Already I'm getting a really good vibe from that. So, and I think the Shudder crowd who love horror, love folk horror, there's a great documentary on Shudder about folk horror. So I think they will dig it in a way that others might not. So we will see. We will see.
It's all part of the adventure, isn't it? And and it's going to live on. It's going to live on. And
like authors with novels, we get fixated around publication day, publication week, release day, release week. We get fixated on that, and because it's a measurable metric, do we get in the top 10? Do we whatever? Yeah. But actually, that thing of are people still talking about it 10 years down the line? That I guess is the real metric.
Yeah,
maybe.
It is. Well, that's the only time you can actually look back and truly judge, what its life was, what its worth was, and so. It's very hard to do that when you're kind of like right in the middle of that. And you're right, because we've talked about that so many times on the podcast about people, how many times have we seen that post of people saying, I saw it the other day on the BXP team group, and if somebody's saying, so it's launch day for my book. And to be honest, I'm feeling really depressed. Do you remember that? It's a very common, because it's a bit like going and seeing a movie and it not living up to your expectations. It's like, it's all the things that we hope and dream of. But yeah, well, I, for one, okay, so just to put it out there, I absolutely loved it. And I say that completely unbiased.
You're in it.
Well, I know, but the thing was, it was just honestly, Mark, it was one of the most magical nights of my life. It was and I'll talk about this next week, but in amongst the tragedy of what was happening in my real life, to be able to go and just have complete unbounded joy in the cinema and just become completely immersed in it. I mean, God, there's so many amazing things about this movie, folks. If you haven't seen it, I'm so grateful I got to see it in the cinema as well, because it made me remember. And I think we've all forgotten why we go to the cinema, is that sometimes, certain experiences are just like when you see something on a big screen and you hear the music and you see those shots. I love absolutely brilliant. Yeah. But anyway, to be continued, Mr. Stay. Yes. This story has not ended yet.
No, I don't think
so. Not ended yet. Brilliant. So, Mark, I'm guessing there might be a little bit of social media this week.
There is a little bit of social media. There's some lovely, lovely news. So, Inkborn Blade on Twitter yesterday marked 365 consecutive days, 1 year of my 200 words a day journey, 153,000 words written in that time. Not all are amazing. In fact, not many of them. Go easy on yourself. But they're on the page and they can only be improved. Only got the bestseller experiment to thank for putting me on the path. Well, Inkborn Blade, who I've met a couple of times, fantastic stuff. Huge congratulations. Huge congratulations on that. And keep going, buddy. Keep going.
That's 153,000 words. That's like the equivalent of 2 full novels in 1 year.
Yeah.
Brilliant stuff.
Or one Brandon Sanderson short story.
Yeah.
At the other end, and then we've got Sarah Zeman, who is on Twitter as @BardyMum. She says, every time I listen to the podcast, and she's a Patreon supporter, she says, I get all inspired and then remember I'm a children's poet. And sometimes 200 words is more than an entire poem. Any chance of a poet's version where we can record fiddled about with line breaks all day, please? And I did say, you know, we do have a kind of exchange rate for editing that she can probably apply. And what's set for poetry? So what is that? 20 minutes work equals?
20 minutes. Yeah. 20 minutes is 200 words. Right?
200 words. So yeah, that's definitely. And Sarah says, I know it's a big dream for a children's poet to become a bestseller, but I replied to Sarah, I said, now you know how Mr. D loves big dreams. So, you know, why not become a children's poet bestseller, Sarah? Why the hell not?
And if you'd like to join Sarah, just go to fiddleaboutwithlinebreaks.com, where we have a new challenge for children's poet authors. But no, seriously, Sarah, I think it's really interesting and it's very relevant. You know, and I think this idea of this exchange rate that we've created, because it's about time. I mean, 200 words, absolutely, but it's ultimately about time of sitting down and doing the work each day that keeps everything connected. So you fiddle as much as you want, because what will eventually come out of that will be a really, really, you know, beautiful, no doubt, children's poem. And maybe you could send one in to us, because it's a poem. Yeah. We can read it out on the show. So there you go. There's your accountability. Send us one of your poems.
Great bit of news on the Academy from Karen Story. She said, last month I posted in wins, and we have a whole wins forum in the Academy where you can talk about your wins, big or small. She said, I've been listed in 2 short story contests. I said in one of my posts half jokingly that I'd like an actual prize win soon. Well, guess what? Karen just had an actual prize win. My first ever, she says. My ridiculous tongue-in-cheek story that got listed a few weeks back in the Cranked Anvil competition took second prize today. My first writing payment. Woo-hoo. How shall I spend the £75? Well, first writing payment. That is always a complete joy. Huge. Congratulations, Karen. 75 quid. Ooh, what can you do with that?
That's, oh my gosh, the mind
boggles,
that's a night out.
It? Yeah,
that's a pint. That's a pint of beer at Leicester Square, Mark.
It really is, isn't it? It really is, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome, though. Congratulations. Karen's been knocking it out of the park, actually.
She really has.
Doing coaching with Karen on the Academy, and she's one of these people who's just been writing tons of short stories and entering short stories competitions. And now, you know, it's proof in the pudding. You keep going, you keep pushing it out there. You might not win on the first one or get recognition, but you keep doing it. You get better and better at it, and bingo.
Absolutely. And last but by no means least, Robin Sarti, one of the longest standing supporters of our podcast. She says, at the end of December, I submitted to a short story call. It was a long shot. I had no confidence in the story, but I needed to submit solely so I could feel the sense of accomplishing something. Well, I found out this past week that I got in, and the project is going live via Kickstarter this week. And her story, Striker Stand, is in volume 1. So I'm going to put a link in the show notes to Thrill Ride, the magazine, which is the Kickstarter. So if you want to support Robin with that and other writers like her, there's a link to Kickstarter where you can help them out. And please do.
Love it, love it, love it. Well, listen, folks, thank you so much for journeying with us today. Thank you to Richard for such an amazing interview. What a treat and a privilege to have him on the show. Absolutely brilliant. And for all the insights as well, and for everything, you know, sharing your stories with us, your wins. Congratulations to everyone out there who's had something good happen in their life this week. That, folks, is what it's all about. It's those beautiful little moments in our life that, you know, if you get enough of them over your lifetime, it really does result in a life well lived. So keep it up, folks. Keep on pushing. Keep on living the dream, as it were. And until next week, Mr. Stay, thank you so much for joining in on all of the insanity that was today's show. For anyone who hasn't known, but we've just recorded, by the way. If you've not listened to the extended, if you how long are we recording for? I'm looking at this. I've
got an hour 20 here.
An hour 20 plus the interview. We're almost up to 2 hours. This officially
plus a break for continuity errors.
Plus a break for continuity. Yeah, you've got to subscribe to the extended version and watch the video and see if you spot the continuity error that happens. It's genius. Thank you to our editors, JD
yes.
and Dave for doing all of the magic behind the scenes, including the bit in Richard's interview, which we won't talk about. That was fantastic as well. Absolutely, it's all over the shop today. But this has been the longest ever episode. So if you want to be a part of history, go subscribe. And actually, folks, in all seriousness, everyone who subscribes, we're so grateful for the 4 people that joined Patreon this week. Everyone that subscribes enables us to do stuff like this, get these extended episodes for me and Mark to sit for 2 hours when we should actually be doing proper work, right? So please do subscribe, listen to the extended. It's an absolute blast, and there's a ton of stuff. I mean, I can't even list it all, but and to do that, bestsellerexperiment.com/support. Sign up to one of the tiers and listen to everything else that we offer beyond just today's extended as well. So, Mr. Stay,
and if you want to drop us a line, yes, you can see you're at practice.
I'm totally at practice.
If you want to drop us a line, we're at bestsellerexperiment.com. There's a contact tab there, or Facebook, we're Bestseller Experiment, and Twitter and Instagram, we're at BestsellerXP. If you've got a question, want to tell us your wins, tell us some good news, drop us a line there. We will share it with the world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us today, folks. And we look forward to bringing you more Bestseller Experiment madness next Monday. All the best. And it's a goodbye from Mark 1.
And a goodbye from Mark 2.
Goodbye.